Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to today's Know Your Records program. I'm pleased that you're here. As you know, we have these weekly lectures every Thursday at 11 o'clock. And I just wanted to point out to you, pardon me, on the back of your program, it has a listing of all of the programs that are coming up in the next month. And I just noticed that I neglected to mention the Department of State Records lecture that will take place here on June 9th. Thank you. So that will be June 9th at 11 o'clock in this room. So today is looking in all the right places, overlooked documents for Japanese American family history at the National Archives. And I'm pleased to have Dr. Pamela Lusnoji. And bear with me, I'm going to read her biography, and it's also found in your program. Dr. Lusnoji has been doing genealogy for about 6 years after a career in medieval art as a medieval art historian. While her own family research takes her most often to New England and Pennsylvania, her extended family story was so intriguing that she became very interested in the Asian immigrant experience on the West Coast and Hawaii. She is a graduate of the National Institute on Genealogical Research, 2008, and has worked as a volunteer at the National Archives and at her local Family History Center. Currently, she is studying with the ProGen 6 group, is active in the Montgomery County, Maryland Genealogy Club, and lectures locally. And recently, she joined the genealogy staff at the Daughters of the American Revolution. So today, the program will be about an hour long. If you have a burning question, go ahead and ask, but if you can wait till the end, because this will be a full program. And I really enjoyed her on Tuesday, and I think you'll enjoy her very much today as well. Dr. Noji.
Charlotte, you said that Shelby is with you. Can you please come down and participate? You would like those of us to?
Okay, they tell me this mic is on at this point. Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Let me just start the slideshow. So, you're right, I don't necessarily look the part of a Japanese American, but I am, well, I don't play one on TV, but I am married to one. So I took his family, my husband's family, sort of as my own. Mine is very small, and his is quite large, and they're now my family. What I hope you come away today from this lecture with is an understanding of what is here at the National Archives, both A1, A2, where or how you get at it, and then what is it going to tell you. So those are the three major things I hope that you learn today. This is the sort of structure of the lecture, and you can see that we're going to go through a variety of different parts, so please bear with me. How many in here are old hands at researching here at Archives? Okay. I will then go and talk about pull slips and exactly how you get at this stuff, because for me that was one of the hardest things, to understand what's really available, and everything is put in a different order, so you have to put different things on each pull slip. So let's just start with a bit of history. Of course, it all started with Pearl Harbor or with Executive Order 9066, depending on how you look at the situation. But certainly very quickly after Pearl Harbor in February 1942, there was the order for evacuation. And this is just an image from one of the record groups of a call of people to register. So what we've got going on here is Department of Justice records that have to do with the FBI beginning to arrest undesirable aliens. The Western Defense Command and Wartime Civil Control Administration that took care of voluntary evacuation. It was really a short period of voluntary evacuation before camp began. And then the assembly centers, which were the first step on getting into camp. The Provost Marshal actually then bothered, well, that office anyway, bothered themselves to look into some other sets of civilian undesirable aliens. And then certainly the War Relocation Authority, RG-220, are the ones that took care of camps and then the resettlement after the war. So those are the basic main record groups that we're going to be looking at today. So first, you went to assembly centers. The thing that strikes me as so amazing is the executive order was in February. Do you know people were in assembly centers by March? These were truly temporary places to stay. I mean, if the camps weren't really the greatest places in the world, assembly centers were really fairly horrible. You can see this particular shack at Tanforan. One of my relatives was at Santa Anita, which was actually a raceway, and they stayed in horse stalls. You can see a partial list here. There were more assembly centers than I've listed here, but it's interesting they were all closed by October 42 because, of course, where did you really get to go but camp itself? So this is a picture of Minidoka where my husband's father's family was. That is the list of the full number of relocation camps. To me, it's also, excuse me, sorry, extremely interesting that something that we might think of as so horrendous is referred to in the Japanese American community as something that sounds so benign. Oh, I was in camp. You know, camp makes you think of summer camp, fun. But that is what most people that I know, anyway, refer to it as, is the time in camp. You can see that the last closure was in March 1946. Interestingly enough, there were actually people who didn't want to leave camp at the end because they felt very safe there and weren't sure what their reception was going to be on the outside, but certainly they couldn't keep camps going forever and ever after the war. The men who were arrested at the beginning of the war were kept in DOJ camps. If you were deemed not a terrible alien, you were then paroled to the camps to be with your family. But the men who were arrested pretty much missed the assembly center section of this, but they went directly to camp from the DOJ camps. Then after the war, pretty much immediately after, you can see from 1948, there were some attempts to get redress. This was basically monetary compensation for physical losses of property and so forth. We'll talk about that real briefly. Then in 1981, there were the hearings about the relocation camp situation. What was it like? Should we be thinking about apology? Should we be thinking about redress? And it did end up in 1988 with the formal apology that President Reagan is signing there and a certain monetary compensation given to survivors. Although by that point, many survivors had already passed away. There was nobody to give the money to. Anyway, here's a little something about the archives. It's just a quick, brief notion of how you might want to begin your research here. This is the web page that you should start out with for Japanese American research, and you might note from your handout that the URL has changed a little bit since they redid the website. It's got /internment-intro.html at the end of it now, which it didn't have on your handout. So this is kind of the portal page. Get you somewhat oriented. I do suggest clicking, oh, I have a thingamajig, don't I? Clicking up here to actually listen to a radio broadcast from the time period. And you'll notice that it starts giving you some idea of the same record groups that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more in depth. Then this is just the rest of the website. I couldn't fit it all in one screenshot. And it gives you, again, hot links to everything that you would need to begin to get into these record groups. But of course, the website never tells you actually how to pull things, how things are organized in the paper records. And then it gives you hot links to AAD and ARC, which we'll talk about briefly because they can help you move along with your research. So here's a pull slip. Don't know how familiar you are with all of these things, but what I have now circled in red are the absolute minimum things you need to put on your pull slip. You need your record group, you need your entry number, you need some title for what the name of the record is, and then you need some way to find the subset of that record you need. And that's what really changes from time to time. You might be ordering up a box number, you might be ordering up a case file number, there's different things, and that's why knowing how any given record group is sort of divided up and stored is very helpful to write out your pull slip. That's what you need at the bare minimum and what you need if you're down at Archives 1. Up here at A2, they prefer that you also add this information, which is the physical location information of where the person who has to go into the stacks will find it. That information is available to you in blue binders up in the pull room. If you're just beginning, please ask for help. Really, the archivists are very, very nice, but once you get going, they do sort of expect you to get that yourself. So on some of my indications, I've also given you the location document so that you have just those numbers and you don't have to look them up. So I'm going to start with important documents and then sort of move down to ones that perhaps tell you less quickly really important facts about your family. And most of the important documents are in fact at A1, not up here at A2. The evacuee case files is where you're going to find the biggest chunk of information about a specific individual quickly and easily, because they are in fact ordered by surname and then first name, and they are a file about an individual. Not every record that I'm going to talk about is really about an individual, but you can find individual names in them. So the entry number is 22, you put the surname, you put the first name. This one has what's called a B6 restriction, which means you have to prove that the person is deceased or show a letter saying that you have permission to look at the file if somebody is still alive. And certainly there are many people who are still alive who were in camp, especially a gentleman that I know who you'll see a little bit more about. He was born in camp. So he's born in 43, so he's definitely very much alive. So to see his file, I would, unless they made a mistake and gave me a file they shouldn't, I would need a letter from him. And my father-in-law and mother-in-law were very happy to give me letters. So I have seen files from living people, but otherwise just a death certificate, SSDI, actually a picture of a gravestone pretty much works. So the way to get going is with AAD, access to archival databases. You might already know that the person you're looking at was in camp and you can go right to ordering the file. But if you need to figure out if a file exists for a particular person, you put your name in, and pretty much if you're going to put in an Asian surname in just the main search box, you're going to come up with some set of hits for here. Hello. Well, anyway, the thing in red, that is the records about Japanese Americans interned. You can see I put in Kumasaka, and I got 30 hits. So then the next page is, when you click on the link, you come to this page, which gives you the list of all Kumasakas who were in camp. And the nice thing, I really hope that this worked. Oh yeah, here we go. The nice thing is that if you didn't already know this, not only do you get the relocation project, i.e. camp, you get the assembly center, and that can be helpful for some future research. And then if you want to look at the actual record, you can click here and see the record. So it gives you some basic information about the person. And for a long time, I thought this was all there was. This is the version on Ancestry. You can also get to the same database on Ancestry, and you get a document that looks pretty much the same and gives you roughly the same information. This is the tip of the iceberg. What you want is the stuff that went into making up this, just sort of a list with some factoids on it. So this is the poll slip that you would do. You've got your RD entry. It's a evacuee case file for Bertha, and I've got my B6 information connected to the poll slip. And this is what you get. And there is one of these. I mean, you get a variety of different things in the files, but there is at least this in every single file. This is the individual record file. Okay, so this tells us quickly and easily probably the greatest bulk of information about a family member that we're going to find, because I look at this stuff from the perspective of a genealogist, a family historian. So what we get is a birth date. We get a birthplace. Most of the time this is going to be somewhere in Japan, but this lady actually was born in Honolulu, which actually made her situation a little bit weird because there was an issue about whether she was an alien or wasn't an alien. But of course, it really didn't matter because they interned a whole bunch of people who were citizens. So, but it did cause a little bit of problem about her status. It gives you her parents. It gives you where they are from or where they were born. And if the person who was in camp happened to be fairly old, as my husband's great-grandfather was in camp, his parents get you back to somewhere in like the 1860s, 1850s in Japan, which is pretty good. And it's in English, which is really the great thing about these records. There's very little in Japanese. It's mostly in English. So then we also get her husband's occupation in the US. This couple actually happened to immigrate, well, at least to Hawaii. Never knew that Grandpa Tezo had a noodle shop. Okay, it doesn't help you build your family tree, but it does help you know more about what their life was like. Then you get the spouse. You get where the spouse is living. So you can tell if the spouse is living in camp with her, and he does, in fact, have the same address as she has. But let's say her husband was still arrested and in a DOJ camp, you would know that. So that would be helpful. Then you get her AR number. You might not think this is all that exciting, but if you ever need to go to the USCIS for any of the immigration naturalization type documents that they have in their new genealogy program that makes it a little bit easier to get there, although it's not cheap, having the AR number gets you exactly where you need to go very quickly. You don't have to go through searching. You can really just give them the AR number. So that's actually helpful. Then you get something about the woman's education, or the man's, or the kid's. So she completed the 8th grade. We might not think that's a great education, but look what is fun. Who knew? She went to cooking school in Honolulu. This is a fact I didn't know about Grandma Noji, so this is cool. Then we also know what she did for a living before the war. She was a greenhouse keeper. Whoops. And then we know height and weight. Is that absolutely necessary in family history? No, but it's kind of fun. And the thing that's interesting down here is they give us a little extra bit of information about her being hard of hearing, a little bit more medical information and remarks, that she punctured her eardrum when she was 10 years old. Now, my husband knew Grandma Noji was hard of hearing, but of course by the time he knew her, she was an older woman. He had no idea that it was an accident early on in her life that caused her to be hard of hearing for all of her life. Then there's some other information on the other page, which there's not much for this woman, but especially if you were a man and had had a lot of different jobs throughout time, you'll get kind of an entire work history. And then the next document that you get, pretty much for everybody as well, is something called a leave clearance form. You may not be aware that fairly early on, to be honest, in the time of being in camp, like late 1943, you were allowed to get out of camp if you promised to go somewhere that wasn't in the exclusion zone. So you needed a leave clearance form. And then, of course, by the time the end of camp came, pretty much everybody filled out a leave clearance form. And again, you get tons of information. Some of this duplicates what's on the individual record form, and sometimes there's some extra information. This one is kind of interesting because although we have the names of her parents before, she's now kind of waffled a bit and said that her mother was born in Hawaii, which is not quite true. Her mother was, in fact, born in Miyagi-Ken. But we get this little thing, may be evacuated. Since the mother was living in Hawaii at the time of the war, who knew what her status was? Because nobody was sure who was and wasn't evacuated from Hawaii. So it gives you a sense that you might want to be looking into what's going on here, because she was in a little bit of a dicey situation, not being specifically in camp with this family and not being back in Japan. She's kind of in limbo, and we might want to look for more documents. Then, in addition to the husband, which we see here, and we saw him on the other form as well, we now get all of the kids and where they're living, so you'll know whether they're in camp with the family, whether they're not. And sometimes if a child was already, let's say, old enough to be out at college and was not in the exclusion zone, they would not be in camp with the family, but you would then know about them even if they weren't there. And in this case, there were several more children, so there were pages on the back, but I don't need to show you the extra pages. The particularly fun thing about this document is it gives you relatives in Japan, not just people who are in the United States. And we had no idea when we got these records that there was a brother living in Japan. And you might notice that the brother's name is Toramatsu Kurosawa. Well, if you think this woman's name is Noji because she's married, but if you look at her father's name, her maiden name is Ichijo. So you go like, why is her brother Mr. Kurosawa? This doesn't seem to make sense. Well, it's a tradition in Japan sometimes to be what's called a yoshi. And that's where a man sort of becomes part of his wife's family and takes his wife's last name to become an heir to that family if there's no male heirs. Well, that's a nightmare for genealogists, really, because you don't expect that to happen. And how are you going to trace that this guy, I mean, if you're looking at this guy is no more a Toramatsu, no more a Kurosawa than I am. He's an Ichijo, but you're going to come at that kind of weirdness by looking at this document and then obviously having to do a little bit more work on it to find out what's going on with this naming problem. But it's about being a yoshi. And then you get some other information. What's her religion? Baptist. You might think that everybody who was in camp was Buddhist. Absolutely incorrect. There were Baptists and Methodists in particular, along with Buddhists. That may lead you to other kinds of records to know what their religion is. So that can be helpful. Then this document is a 4-page document. So that was page 1 and 2. And this is the interior, or actually it's probably 1 and 4, and this is the interior of the document. But it gives you some other information. Language facility. Did the person speak and or read English and Japanese, or Japanese? Because some people could speak Japanese perhaps and not be able to write it even. So it gives you some idea of that. Down here, this can be more particularly interesting for men than women, and this is obviously a woman's form. What organizations you belong to. This is one of the things that got men in particular into trouble and got them arrested rather than simply interned was, how should we say, associating with the wrong kind of organizations that might have had more subversive agendas. She just happened to give some money to the Red Cross. I mean, really. How un-American, right, is this? It's obviously not un-American. But the other thing that could get you in trouble was what newspapers you took, or magazines, journals. This is a local Japanese language newspaper that she took, and it doesn't seem to me that this one was particularly problematic, but there were other publications that if you were known to read them, that put you in a different kind of a group. So that at least tells you whether the person was more likely to have had more trouble with the authorities or less. And then this one is fun. Now, this is a woman, so these two questions 27, 28, I think are the numbers. I don't know if you've heard of the story of the No-No Boys. The No-No Boys were a set of young men in Tule Lake in particular who were asked to answer these questions. And they had great difficulty in trying to figure out how they wanted to answer them because the way they're worded it's a bit unusual. And I don't know if you can actually read them. But it's about your loyalty, about whether you would fight for the United States if asked. And they felt that they were kind of in a bind, that they would be screwed, as it were, whether they answered yes or no. So they answered no and no. They made a pact, and a whole bunch of guys wrote no and no. For women, it wasn't such a big deal because they weren't ever going to be asked to fight. But what's fun sometimes is later on they changed the wording of questions 27 and 28. And you will find this very document for other people with a stapled over piece of paper that has the new wordings of 27 and 28 with the answers on it, but you can look underneath and see what the answers were before. So that can be fun. And that actually perpetrated a wholesale exchange of people among the different camps, with certain people sent to Tule Lake because they were rabble-rousers, and people who were sent out of Tule Lake. So you think, you got to get all these people together in the first place, and then they smunched them all around at the end of 1943 anyway. So there was a lot of stuff going on. So let's look at some of the other kinds of documents that you can find in these files. And I'm really going to hit the highlights of the major ones that will be helpful to you. You never know what else you're going to find in these documents, or in these files. This is a work card. Pretty much everybody had a work card. And if you were too young to work, you had a school card. And there are some fun school documents. You can find out what your ancestor did on, whatever standardized test that you took in the 6th grade or whatever. Remember, these were functioning cities, basically. There were schools, there were hospitals, there were police, there were all kinds of things. These people lived almost the regular American life, but simply behind barbed wire and in really crummy housing. So what we find out here is, what did the guy do before camp? So he was working in a florist shop, and he was a barber. We kind of knew that, this is my husband's great-grandfather, we kind of knew that Ji-chan was a barber, but anyway, this makes it clear, and if you didn't know that about your family member, so much the better. But then it also details the work that people did in camp. Again, this is a city, people needed to do something to keep the place running. They didn't have all just outside people come in and run everything. Women often worked in the mess hall. Men did a bunch of other things. As a matter of fact, sometimes it went along with what they did outside of camp, and sometimes it was like, how did he do that? I think, is this the one? Chimney sweep. Where did a guy who was a barber and work in a florist shop know how to be a chimney sweep? Who knows? But he got a job doing that. You could make a small amount of money. And there was some kind of an internal economy that money was helpful to buy things. You could, in fact, physically buy things. It wasn't just that you had to take what came in the cafeteria. The thing that's fun is to find out sometimes why you changed jobs. Notice he's had kind of a few. One of them, reduction in force. You could even get rift in camp. And then there was Uncle George. Uncle George worked in the mess hall. Uncle George got fired for being drunk and disorderly. So you can find out some interesting things, not only about what they did, but why they were fired from one particular job before they got to the next one. Medical info. Pretty much everybody, it seems, had a dental chart. Is that helpful for you to push back your family tree? No, but it's fun. This happens to be from my father-in-law. But you do have to be a bit careful with some of these documents. These have very, very personal information in them. And even though this is for a file for a woman who has passed away, it's about a pregnancy at term, the child born here is not passed away. So you want to be careful perhaps about some of the things that you might divulge. I've learned a few things that I cannot tell people because I do think it would be way too hurtful. So I also learned from this, exactly what time the baby was born and what kind of problems there were afterwards, and that they got an extra ration of orange juice because they had a baby in the household. For another woman, I found out her entire pregnancy history, including miscarriages and the fact she'd left her husband once but went back and got pregnant again and that child died. So you can get all kinds of things that you're not going to get out of your typical vital statistic type record. You can get an entire story. Then another part of your packet for that leave clearance slip that I showed you was letters of support, people from the outside saying, good Joes, really nice people, really you should let them out, they're going to be productive, everything's going to be fine, they're not really going to harm anything. The thing that's kind of fun is some of the specific buzzwords about what made them good people to leave, okay? Loyal Americans, this is obviously number one, right? But don't you love this? No drunkenness or venereal disease. I can't tell you how many times I saw that in these letters. I mean, that's like not the thing I would have thunk of, really, to be perfectly honest. Some of the other things that were particularly good things for you to be or to have is to be industrious, to already have a fairly good education, and I have to admit that being Christian also helped. You would not perhaps have thought that property would be a mainstay of some of the documents in these folders. But it is. Property is a big thing. The story usually with the family is, my God, we had 3 days. We had to sell everything we owned, property, housing, as well as personal items, and we walked with 1 suitcase into camp. Well, I think you did walk into camp with 1 suitcase, but the question is, did you really have to sell and lose everything you ever had? These documents seem to suggest to me that that is incorrect. I can't tell you for sure because some of these seem to be parts of a story and I can't quite put together the whole story. But at any rate, this is from the file of my grandfather-in-law, Grandpa, whom I actually met before he died. This is a family photograph of the store that they had in Tacoma, Washington. There is now a Lazy Boy store there. But it was a pretty well-known market, gas station, flower shop. It had a whole bunch of things that Grandpa got this business going. Here are lists and lists and lists of stuff from that property, including this lovely hand-drawn map of all the rooms in that building. This is actually a map of this building. What's in every room, which 2 rooms were locked, where the key to the locked room is. And not just in this, but in other types of files, there were just tons of bills of lading for shipments of all kinds of things and storage. So my theory is that more things than you might have thought were in fact taken by the government and stored, and some I can prove were given back to people at the end of the war. In addition, this property, which of course they couldn't sell in a couple of days after things went belly up and after Ji-chun was arrested, because Ji-chun was actually arrested and did go to the GOJ camps before he was paroled. There were letters about a guy on the outside, family was already in camp, saying, well, I'm trying to find a buyer and we're trying to get the deed, and well, this guy offered this much and this guy offered this much. They were selling the property. I would assume they got the money. I unfortunately have nobody in the family left that I can ask this question of, because the people who would know are all passed away now. But I still think that they did not lose everything in quite the way that a lot of people seem to talk about. And I know from a fact, because they signed that they received this stuff, they received the entire contents of their safe deposit box, including something like $2,200.80 or something like that. I would love to have some of these things, I can tell you. I don't know where a single one of those items is, but I know the family did get the contents of their safe deposit box. Now, I talked about leaving camp. Leaving camp was something that people did a whole lot more than you would think, and they started doing it pretty early. One of the main reasons was the fact that there weren't enough people to take in the sugar beet crop. Now, I don't know why sugar beets were so important, but they were. And so people would get out of camp, particularly to go and do seasonal work at farms. This is my father-in-law's get out of jail card, as it were, for temporary. These were only temporary. You did have to come back, and you were kept in dormitories and probably looked after a little bit by somebody who was in authority. But this is the only photograph we have of my father-in-law from this time period. There was a whole lot of stuff going on that the family could take tons of photographs. So it's really one of the youngest photographs that we have of my father-in-law. And then this is fun because this shows a different reason that a guy got out of camp briefly. Notice this is a reinduction pass, so it's for him coming back. He didn't get to leave forever, but he went to a YMCA older boys conference. So there was some in and out for some purposes. And then this letter is actually what they call terminal leave, which is when you left forever, where Ji-chang, this older gentleman, was asking for permission to go to Rochester, where the family was repatriated, or resettled, I should say, by a specific time frame to help get his grandkids into school, because the school opening day was X, and he wasn't supposed to leave until Y, but he wanted to leave earlier. And I don't actually know whether he was allowed to do that, but at least I have this letter suggesting that he asked. One of the sadder stories that I read in some of these letters asking to leave camp was a family that found out that one of their daughters, who was living outside the exclusion zone, so was not placed in camp, had been ill, had been hospitalized, and then was going to be discharged, but was still much an invalid, had nowhere to go and no one to care for her, and they had to beg to be able to get out of camp to go and help her. And that was very sad. So basic family data cards is another type of record that you can get after we've gone through that big file that has all the really cool stuff. Okay, so we've got an entry number here. This is done by camp and then by surname. So that tells you how the documents are organized. This gives you an idea of a pull slip. So we're going to look at Minidoka for the name Noji. And every family had one card like this for every year they were in camp. So if you don't already know, it actually puts your families together, not just all people with the same last name. You've got, it's kind of like a mini census because you've got relationship to head of household, birth date, birthplace, and here you can see 12/29/1943, this kid was born in camp, and the card for the year before doesn't have this child on it. And then all of a sudden you see another child come up in this grouping. So again, this duplicates some information that's available elsewhere, but it's nice to put the whole family together. And it's fun because this tells you how much the family members, each family member made at their different jobs in camp. So you can get a sense of whether they had at least a little bit of spending money. The individual locator cards, entry 23, simply by surname. These don't tell you anything particularly new, but I find these so fun because they tell you every single time he left camp. This is my father-in-law. He hated camp. He won't talk about camp anymore. So he left at every opportunity. So he goes out. You leave Minnie and you go out to something. You go Minnie to seasonal Paul FSA camp in Idaho. And this was this, I don't know whether it was always sugar beets, but it was definitely farming. And then you go back into camp, then you leave camp again, and now you went out for seasonal work to Hazleton. And I was able to absolutely pinpoint that at one time he left at the same time to the same place as his sister. So I know at one point he and Auntie Sachi left and worked together at the same place. And then it does give you the terminal leave. So you know exactly the day he left camp at the end of the war, 6/11/45. You know the address he went to. And sometimes if you get a bunch of these, you can figure out, again, if you don't already know how a family is put together, everybody going to that same address is very likely to be related. The final accountability rosters exist actually now on microfilm. You can't see the paper documents. The microfilm is just down at A1. You can pull it yourself. I mean, it's in the open stacks, as it were. It's by camp and then by surname. And here's what one of them looks like. Again, it gives you a bunch of information, some of which you may already have had. You've got your kumasakas here. They're all in alpha order, so you can't actually see a family together, but you can actually put your families together by matching up family numbers, because every family had its own number. You got birth dates again, some information. And what's kind of fun out here, which probably also comes from those locator cards, but here it's all in one place, where the family went to after camp. Because sometimes people went to some place very briefly and then settled elsewhere. You might think the family was from X, but they may have had a short moment in another place that you don't know about. And it supposedly should show you the place they went very, very first after camp. You would be, and I told you that there was this kind of mixing around after October 1943, you would be listed with the camp you were first placed in, not the camp you ended up in. And this is a little bit more about the transfers, but this is the first transfer you had to get from your assembly center to your camp. These are actually somewhat more difficult records to work with. You have to go by camp name, and then the camp they went to. Then you have to know the assembly center they came from. That's in alpha order in the box. And then you have to look through every page until you come up with this. And I did find, I got a fair number of hits. But it gives you a sense of the date that they moved. And then this is your basic, like a ship manifest, but it's a train. It's everybody who went together on that day from that center to that center. And then I found my family all together and could find that Grandma, well, this is actually Baba-chan. Baba-chan was with the family, but Ji-chan's not, because Ji-chan's still in the DOJ center because Ji-chan was arrested. So again, I said those men missed the assembly center stage, and if they were paroled directly to camp. Do you really need to know this? I don't know. I found this fascinating, to think of almost closed trains running all over the West, shipping people from hither and yon, the amount of organization that went into this. I mean, I'm amazed the time, the money, the energy that went into keeping these people and moving these people around for what we now think, really, truly to no purpose except waste. The internal security cases, these are some of the most fun records. Think about it, like I said, it's a city. As a matter of fact, Tule Lake was the largest city in Northern California at that time, because there weren't really cities or big ones up there. You're going to have police situations. You're going to have people who do naughty things. This is done in a two-parter. You've got the, this entry 52 by case, by camp and by surname. You need to get the case number. Then, and it's B6 restricted, but if you've got your right documentation, you go to entry 51 and you go by camp and case number, and then you can get the documentation behind the card. So this is an index card for Mrs. Kentaro Noji, this is Grandma Noji, this same Shizue who we saw her individual record. She reports a loss. Case 419. She lost it on this date, and it was found on this date, so it's one day. And you're sort of wondering, reports lost, so what else can we learn about this? So this is the documentation in the actual case file once I got case number 419. Whoops. She lost her alligator bag. It tells you exactly what was in it. You might wonder why she was carrying around 6 Montgomery Ward drafts. That suggests, again, a little bit more about an economy in which you could, in fact, purchase things even from the outside and have them shipped in. And then it tells us that it was found, by whom, when, what circumstances. It's pretty good fun. There are, of course, more serious situations. There were murders. There were noise disturbances. And actually, one of the fun things that I came up with was Auntie Sachi also had a loss kind of a card. She lost her algebra book and a pen, or 32 cents or something. I can't quite remember now. I called her up. I said, hey, Auntie Sachi, you remember this? I found this document about you in the National Archives. And she thought a minute. She said, She said, oh, my God. It was something she herself had forgotten, but all of a sudden she was remembering back. It was the day her brother was born, that kid that was born in camp. And everything was crazy. And she said, Mom was running here, and Dad was over here, and this. And this brought back all of these memories to her from this one case card that I found for her. So I find these actually really fun. They are slice of life situations, absolutely slice of life. So real property cards, again, this notion that everybody lost everything, I'm not so sure. So here's your entry number and the way it's organized, state, county, and surname. These exist for Washington, Oregon, and California. And this is just one of the cards. I looked up Seattle because some of our family was from Seattle, and this is definitely Toshihiko Senda. And it tells you what property left behind. It was a 2-story building, where it is, how much it was worth. This is true for urban property and farm property. My sense, and I can't prove this yet, I haven't looked into it fully, is that this is property that was sort of being held and that you got back after camp rather than losing it. And sometimes you will have the name of the caretaker who was taking care of the property for the family when the family was in camp. So that's the stuff at Archives 1. Archives 2 also has some stuff that I still call important. The enemy alien cards. This has to do with those guys who were arrested. There's a couple of ways that you have to get at this information. You can check ARC and get the case number there, and then you can get either the box with the case number, or you can also get the card. I would suggest getting both. When you go to ARC, you put in your Asian last name. Again, you don't have to be terribly specific where you drill down to, because an Asian last name is likely to give you some kinds of hits in these kind of records. And what you get for this gentleman is Japanese internee card for Mitsugi Noji. Okay, so you click on that blue hot link and you get this page. And here is the agency assigned number. That is the case number. That's the case number that you want to put down. But you can also click on the series and get to the page that gives you different information. Go to archived copies, view container list, and then there's only 11 boxes, but by alpha order, you can get the initial card for this case, even as well as getting the case itself. So this is one of the cards. Some have more information, some have less. Again, it gives you the case number. But what's kind of fascinating here, it gives you exactly the date he was apprehended, where he was transferred to, when was the warrant for his arrest issued, when did he fill out his questionnaire, and then some other dates about what happened to him. So the thing it kind of brings to life that moment of arrest. And then if you use this entry number and get the case file number, you end up with the actual case. And here you can get sometimes amazing sets of documents, including such things as an actual interrogation. Guy says X, your guy says Y. Guy asks X, your guy answers. This is sort of a summary form. You get some of the facts that the guy gave. So this guy talks about that he has a brother in Japan, which we knew nothing about, that he has another daughter that's still in Japan and one daughter in America, but both were born in Japan. My husband sort of did know about that other auntie, but I didn't. Sometimes you get the impressions of the arresting officers about the subject. There's even one document that I read that gave them a blow-by-blow of the moment of the arrest. We knocked on the door. It's got the names of the 3 guys. You know exactly who walked up to the door. We knocked on the door. So-and-so answered. We went in. We looked upstairs for this. We looked over here for this. We found this on the floor or whatever. I mean, you get this, again, slice of the moment kind of a story about how the arrest went down. And then there are a variety of these documents every time status changed, and this shows you that the gentleman has been deemed not quite so much a threat and is, in fact, is going to be paroled to camp to be with his family. But this is the questionnaire. It's a 23-page questionnaire filled out by everybody who was arrested. And again, if you don't have other sets of documents, it gives you just chock-a-block. I mean, this is down to every job he ever had for 10 minutes. It tells you every time he entered and left the United States, what kind of money he has, what's in the bank, did he ever pay taxes? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's amazing amounts of information. And this is just a couple of more pages of it with wife's information, where you were born, where your parents were born, more of all that kind of stuff. But it goes on for 23 pages for every person who was arrested. In these files, you can sometimes find other things. And for Mitsugi Noji, here is a bunch of his neighbors. You notice there are no Japanese names on this list, but they wrote in a petition to get him released. They did, in fact, parole him to camp. They didn't release him per se, but they did let him go to his family. I think they were in Minidoka. And I don't know exactly who submitted this, whether this was this group of people or anyway, I'm not sure. Here we are, a normal American family, standing in front of the beautiful home. You know, again, trying to show that we're like you guys. We shouldn't be arrested. We shouldn't be kept in confinement. So that was the DOJ arresting people. Now, I told you the provost marshal also arrested a couple of people, deciding that people who were working for the government maybe weren't so good risks, a bunch of other people. There's usually not an overlap between people who were arrested DOJ and the people who were arrested by the provost marshal. And usually, though, if somebody then went to camp afterwards, they also have a camp record. What's unusual about this next gentleman is he, in fact, does have a DOJ arrest, a provost marshal arrest, and he went to camp. Poor guy. This is the eldest brother of the family of Kumasakas who emigrated to America in the early 20th century. But the fun things about these, you get your photograph, you get fingerprints, and then some other family information that you may have gotten elsewhere. But if the guy never got to camp and doesn't have an entry 22 file, this is going to be your best bet. The other thing you might not know about is that there were, I don't know whether we would call them prisoner swaps, but we were very nice to people in South America, and we said, we'll take your alien Japanese off your hand and we'll bother to intern them ourselves. So in fact, there are a bunch of Japanese from Argentina who were in some of the DOJ camps, particularly one in Crystal City, Texas. And I got hits on the last name Noji. I cannot tie these people to my husband's family, but what's amazing is this guy living in, actually it wasn't Argentina, it was Peru, sorry, Peru. He's actually a Noji from the same ken as my Nojis are from, so who knows whether there's a connection there. I still am working on that one. Okay, photographs. Everybody loves a picture. They're all up here, because all photographs are up here. So record group 210 is divided between the two buildings because photographs are kept up here. There are still pictures. There's a box list in cabinet 7, drawer 3. I just saw it this morning. It's still up there. There are 19 boxes. However, you don't have to start there if you don't want to. You can start on ARC, throw in your search name, and you might get a hit on a photograph from 210. Here's your identifier. If you want to actually pull the individual photograph, that's the actual identifier you would need in the pull room. The photographs, some, especially if they have a person's name on them, are online. So you can actually click and see this photograph online. You don't even need to go upstairs. But not all of those 19 boxes are online by any means, okay? So if you want to see this particular photo and you want the actual photo, you have to request it by number. But I would suggest, since there are only 19 boxes, to go ahead and request a box, because you're going to get a box anyway. They don't give you one photograph. You're going to get a box full of photographs. And just, you know, if you're looking at Minidoka, get the Minidoka box. And that's just a general picture of people arriving at Minidoka. So it gives you some sense of that. It may not be a photograph of your particular ancestor, but it's an idea of the situation. And then I like this beet farming one because I knew that my father-in-law went out to farm so much. And those photographs are definitely not online, so they truly are not all online. I'm just actually getting into looking at moving pictures and videos that we have upstairs. I've never looked at them before. That's a new thing for me, but they're also moving pictures and audio files that are in record group 210, but here in this building because that's where that medium is stored. Now, I just threw this in. There's not an assembly center folder for every family and every camp. They're on microfilm. They're here in this building, oddly enough. And you have to order up the microfilm here. It's not in the microfilm room just to pull yourself. But if you're interested in the assembly center part of the experience, these are cards pretty much like the family cards for camp, but for assembly center. And I did find the one for my husband's family. And since Kentaro was not arrested, although the whole family story was that Kentaro had been arrested, this is Grandpa Noji, Kentaro's in assembly camp. Kentaro was never arrested, so we found out that a family story was wrong. The thing that I find a little chilling about this one is the notion of what they had been given. There are 7 blankets, 7 cots that they were given or issued as part of their living wonderfulness in good old camp. And here you can sometimes find some other things. In another family's record, there was a set of letters petitioning to be interned with another family with whom they were not directly related, but with whom they had great contact, and they did not want to be split up. And from what I understand, they were not split up. So there are other items of interest. We'll briefly go through them. These are much harder to get at, but they can be fun if you take the time. They're actually all on microfilm down at A1, and they're open microfilms. You just go pull them from the stacks. There is a roll list in the tan binders down there in the finding, well, not quite the finding aids room, in the main room down there. You look up this microfilm number, and you'll find the entire roll list for what's going on. But this tells you general stuff about activities in camp. But you end up encountering individual names. They're just simply not indexed, so you have to look and look and look. But if you know you want to look at Tule Lake, which I did, I started going through the microfilm roll for Tule Lake, and here was it was actually like a study done about the educational situation there. And they had put together a bunch of essays written by kids in a particular English class, and this guy happens to be a relative. I've actually met him. And this is what he wrote back when he was like 8 or 10 years old, talking about his camp experience. I must admit, these are all very, very sad. I mean, I don't know whether you all actually sit in front of microfilm readers or paper boxes and cry, but I do when I do this research. It's very tear-provoking occasionally. But these are wonderful places to look if you have the time to go through. They're nowhere near as easy as just calling up entry 22 and getting a file on an individual. This microfilm has been digitized and is on Ancestry.com. You cannot find it by using the word Japanese in the keyword. You have to use the word Japan and the star, the wild card, in the card catalog for Amazon, and you will get to those documents. They're unindexed. You must browse them. You'd browse them just like you'll browse the microfilm, but you could do it at home in your PJs if you happen to have Ancestry. So they have digitized this. The other thing that you can find on these very same microfilm rolls are the camp newspapers. I told you these are regular cities. They had newspapers, every single camp, sometimes 2, okay? And from very early on, it's like the second they got there, they had newspapers. And what do they have in them? Everything a family historian desires from any local small town newspaper. Vital statistics. Noji, Mr. and Mrs. Kentaro Noji, had a son. There's Uncle Ray, that same kid I keep talking about who was born in camp. You've got his birth notice in here. Oliver Noji, he was a teacher of art at Tule Lake. He was an architect in real life, if you will, or in civilian life. And this basically is an entire biography of the guy. Tells you where he went to school, what he did, he went to Europe. It's great stuff, but you do have to look through them. Once again, they're completely unindexed. What's also fun is up here at A2, guess what? The assembly centers had newspapers. I mean, they were only in the assembly centers from like March to October, and yet they had papers already. This actually is from Santa Anita, which is the one where Auntie Ruri was, which was the horse stalls kind of thingamajig. But again, what do they have in there? Names, 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 names. The entire list of baseball teams and who's on the baseball team. Again, more vital stats. Who was the participant in the musical concert one night? Who was the person in the 4th of July parade? All those kinds of things. They are chock-a-block full of names. Now, these records are not microfilm. These are paper records upstairs. They're very fragile, and there are, I have to admit, unfortunately, relatively few of them. And they're fading fast, but they're up there for your delectation. And then down at Archives 1, there is this list. Remember I told you there was a voluntary evacuation prior to even assembly camps. And there is one microfilm with these cards on them, which are for the approximately 5,000 people who evacuated voluntarily from very early times. And it gives you name, the address they came from, the address they went to. So that could be helpful. And then this is just a beginning smattering of what else you could possibly look at here at the archive. Most of this, I believe, is on your handout, I hope. There's just tons and tons and tons of stuff. I've only really scratched the surface. But I do want to talk about claims and redress really briefly. The Claims Act of 1948 was, getting money back. This is the URL, and I believe this URL has not changed. You can look online go and hot click if there's one of these case files. There's not that many of them. You can click on this hot link for the case file number, but keep the case file number in mind because this is what you'll get online, but you can actually order up the paper documents behind it and really take a look at what was going on. These are usually about some sort of loss of property, occasionally a loss of income that you would have had you been out doing your thing, mostly though about a loss of property. So you'll know something about the pre-war level of wealth of the family. Then remember, in 1981, there was this commission and hearings in 5 different cities on a couple of specific dates. You may or may not know whether the person that you're researching or your family member gave testimony, but it's kind of fun to take a look. There's 3 parts to look at. If you go and look at use this information up here and go to box 104, it basically acts as an index because it's just alphabetical order, but all you get is this little page. But you get the city, the date, and the page number of testimony, and you can get to the actual testimony. And this is, actually, this is the wife of the guy in the photograph from the provost marshal thing. This is Shoji's wife. And she tells about what happened to her during the war, after the war. Their caretaker had not taken care of their property. He'd ripped them off during the war, and then her husband got ill, and then he was never the same after the war, and then he died soon after the war, and the stories are pretty sad, let me tell you. Those were solicited testimonies. There was also unsolicited testimony, which there's only a couple of boxes of. And you can look through those, they're in alpha order, and you get a shorter story of what my camp experience was. Do I think we should get reparations? And this one was so fun. You get a family photograph in there. It's great. And then if you want to read the entire report on justice denied that came out of those hearings, it is completely online here at the archives by chapter. Then the redress files. This is when you got your money after 1988 and the apology. These are exceptionally difficult to work with, to be perfectly honest, and they don't necessarily tell you much, but I wanted to follow it all the way through to the bitter, bitter, bitter end. There's a special finding aid upstairs. You have to talk to Liz Gray. There's almost no way to get at these things without a fair amount of work. And then there's problems with restrictions on some of these files, because even one gentleman he's passed away, and I can prove that. There's information in the file about people who are still alive, and they would not let me have the file. So they have to be checked every file before you're allowed to see them. But I did find one for Tom Kumasaka, who is the gentleman who owned that store that I showed you with the plans and the lists of properties. So this is Tom. This is Grandpa, the man I met before he passed away. I didn't get more information particularly out of it, except the knowledge that he did get the reparation money, and here's his passport with a photo in it. So, it was worth it, but this is down in the weeds sort of stuff. And then really briefly, I wanted to say something about what's important for Japanese American research, but is a little bit beyond the National Archives, although these things are at the regional archives. I'm not sure whether you're aware that all women, American-born women who married foreign nationals lost their citizenship up to 1922. So you married a guy from Poland, you married a guy from wherever the heck, it doesn't matter, you lost your citizenship. Okay, in 1922 that was rectified with the Cable Act, but it didn't help Japanese women, or Japanese American women, or any American woman who married a Japanese national, because there was a lovely little line in the law that said, men eligible for citizenship. Japanese men were not, and Japanese people were not eligible for citizenship. So Japanese, or people who'd married Japanese women, had to wait up till 1931 for them to fix that little glitch in the law. Okay, so 1922 didn't help them. 1931 did. So if you think this went on in your family, you have to think of the 1930s, not when they arrived in America, not 5 years after they arrived. I think 1930s, figure out where the family was living at the time, and then look in that local court. And this is all going to be National Archives type or regional archives type documents because it's post-1906 immigration, blah, blah, blah. At any rate, I got this one out of Seattle, and there is something very, very odd about looking at a naturalization paper and looking where the person put down where they were born. Bellingham, Washington. You don't expect to see that. But women did go and get their citizenship back, so you might want to look into that. Then, of course, finally, 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, finally Japanese were allowed to become American citizenship, or American citizens. So you would want to look, where was the family living in the mid-50s, early to mid-50s, to see if they had naturalized, and you want to look at the documents in the local courts there. This I got out of Laguna Niguel, which is one of the regional archives, and basically naturalizations are pretty much given out to the regional archives. And this actually is the naturalization for that man, Jichan, who was arrested and then sent to camp, but he wanted to become an American citizen. So about 1 year before his first great-grandchild, my husband, was born, he naturalized. And then with that AR number you've got, that we got off of the individual record, go directly to USCIS and get the A file, whatever other kind of files they have about your ancestor. And this is Kentaro, the husband of Shizue, the lady whose individual record you saw. He went back and forth to Japan a couple times, even up into the 1950s, but he never naturalized. So there were other types of records about a guy who's still a foreign national who's going overseas and wants to come back. So there's a fair number of pages of information about him in his, I don't know whether it's just an A file or whether it's an A file plus, but I got a fair number of documents from the USCIS for him. So I hope that you have all learned something about what's here, how you get it, and what fun things it's going to tell you. And I hope you have fun exploring your own experience with Japanese American records here at the National Archives. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Thank you so much. Again, I found it fascinating a second time. So if you just...
Sure.
While you're thinking of your questions, if you could take just about 30 seconds to fill out that evaluation form before you go, that's very helpful to me. And I'll let you go ahead and ask questions. Thank you.
Question. I was fortunate when I first joined the National Archives to process the database that you have that's in AAD.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things I did when I was processing it was I did go and look at the evacuee individual locator cards. And I think for your, for all of this, to understand how the two are related, let me just give a little history.
Okay.
The database that we have in the National Archives that's in AAD came to us through the Department of Justice when they were setting up the reparations process. So they used that as the original database that they then started to administer the reparations process.
Okay.
That database is derived from a duplicate set of the punch cards that you reviewed that's at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley.
At Berkeley.
So what I found interesting when I was doing the processing was to look at the evacuee individual locator cards to see how all of that's a snapshot in time. And what I guess I'm getting around to asking you is that snapshot was done in 1942, and it wasn't clear to me at the time, maybe you can tell, when that snapshot was, whether it was when they were originally in the evacuation centers, or whether it was when they got moved to the camps. I don't know if you could tell that, because to see all the hand annotations, it's too bad that that wasn't also punched, you know, so you could trace somebody through their history. All I know is in 1942, like you can tell from the index, it's a census of everybody who was somewhere.
Yeah, and I know an awful lot of that data on those punch cards. I mean, it's all very meaningful at the top, except that I can't really read what all those sections mean, but they end up coming out in that database. So
correct,
then you don't need to be able to read the card, so you get that information. But as to exactly when that's a snapshot of...
Yeah, keep that in mind.
Yeah, you know, I wonder if I can figure that out from those individual record sheets. because you can tell when they were signed, and the leave clearance sheets, I didn't tell this one little story, but the leave clearance sheets were written up by someone who was working at camp, and they signed it. So you know the date that that leave clearance form was filled out. And there was sort of a funny story that a Kumasaka, which is one of my husband's families, was telling the person all the stuff. And I mean, who would think to look at the person who wrote, you know, the scribe, as it were, who signed the form? But I happened to look down there and I said, Kiyo Ayora, what the heck's going on here? Because Kiyo Ayora was the woman who married Oliver Noji, the guy who was the architect. So long before my husband realized that the Nojis and the Kumasakas came together when his parents married, in camp, Oliver Noji, who is a relative of ours, I mean, he's, I can't remember exactly, you know, second cousin of my husband's father or some such a deal, but anyway, the woman he married took the intake from one of my Kumasaka relatives, so that's kind of fun. So you can find out when those two documents were written, and if one looked at enough of the individual, especially those individual records, and saw that they were all written in 42 or all written in 43 or something, then you might be able to say, well, probably that's when that data also got onto those cards, or that's the date from which that card data, yeah.
At what point was it punched?
I don't know when the physical cards were made, but even to know like when the data that's on the cards is from, it might be the date that the individual records were created, that particular sheet, which is just the front side and the back side. So, but I'm not 100% sure. Any more questions? Well, I hope you all have fun going off and researching away. Sure.
Voluntary vaccines, do they show up? Okay.
No,
That makes
that's a
sense.
whole
That
separate.
makes sense.
So if you know.
So the voluntary evacuees, did they go to assembly centers or they did not?
No.
They
They
did
left
not.
before the assembly center situation
Right,
happened.
right. So I'm wondering.
Because they hoped, I think the government hoped,
That
that
everybody would just-
everybody would leave and they wouldn't have to deal with it. But, you know.
That's
C'est la
really
vie.
fascinating. That helped me, and it's been almost 20 years since I processed that.
Yeah, because that database has been, out there. And
Yeah.
it's
The Japanese